very funny line of talk, Mr. Mansell.
I thought we'd understand one another.
Welcome to beautiful, bad and bizarre on an extremely wet and windy day in Wiltshire. The weather is torrential, but today we're here to visit one of my most favourite actors, George Baker. Born George Morris Baker on the 1st of April 1931 in Varna, Bulgaria, George's Yorkshire-born father, Frank, was a British businessman and a diplomat. His mother, Eva, was an Irish nurse who was working for the Red Cross in Bulgaria. George was one of 5 siblings, and in 1940, not long after the onset of World War II, the children aged between 4 and 14, along with their mother and the family nanny, returned to Britain. But George's father stayed in Bulgaria before moving on to Cairo. Sadly, George was never to see his father again, as Frank Baker had been knocked down by an army truck in Cairo, where he'd been working at the time, and after spending some weeks in hospital, he eventually succumbed to his injuries and died. George was just 12 years old. George Baker went to school at Lancing College in Sussex, but at the age of 15 he knew he wanted to be on the stage, so he left boarding school and went to London, trying various jobs including pool attendant. George eventually got a job in rep at Richmond Theatre in London. In 1950, George Baker was called for national service. However, he soon met his future wife, the costume designer, Julia Squire, at a party, and before being posted to Hong Kong at the age of 19, George married 24-year-old Julia, and together during their marriage they went on to have 4 daughters. Having completed his national service and with acting still a burning passion, George eventually joined the Old Vic. George Baker's good looks and strong voice made him perfect for the silver screen, and so it was films and eventually television that would be the home of George Baker. Often playing heroic characters, George Baker was to begin a long and distinguished career. With over 140 credits in film and television, it would be impossible to list and review every one of them. George Baker's first major breakthrough in films was in the role of Flight Lieutenant David Maltby in the 1955 film The Dam Busters, starring alongside Richard Todd and Michael Redgrave. Also in 1955, George began a much publicised affair with Brigitte Bardot, lasting around 6 weeks when they were working at Pinewood Studios, but on different films. He said of Bardot, "I was completely dazzled by her and hopelessly in lust, but it wasn't really a love affair, because to be honest, I think Brigitte regarded me simply as someone to provide a sort of dalliance with while she was filming." And he also admitted it was a great boost to his ego. In 1958, George starred in the film The Moonraker alongside Sylvia Sims. But it's another 1958 film with George Baker that is my absolute favourite, and that's Tread Softly Stranger. George co-starred alongside Diana Dawes and Terence Morgan, and a certain young singer who was also to become one of my favourite carry-on actors, Jim Dale, performed the theme song for Tread Softly Stranger. George Baker was under contract with Associated British Picture Corporation at the time of filming Tread Softly Stranger. It was filmed at Walton Studios and on location in Halifax. George had recently completed The Moonraker, and in the film his character, Johnny Mansell, who is also a professional gambler, drops in the line, "I'm self-employed. I let the horses do it for me," and then he goes ahead and places a bet on a dead cert called Moonraker. Tread Softly Stranger is a classic film noir based on a love triangle between 2 brothers played by George Baker and Terence Morgan, and their love interest was played by Diana Dawes. Life was about to imitate art for George when he entered into his own love triangle in 1964, but more about that later in the video. Diana Dawes had been having her own marital problems while filming Tread Softly Stranger, as her marriage to Dennis Hamilton, which had always been volatile, was now at a troubling end. But George was impressed with Diana's professionalism. She was always ready with her lines and was not miserable on set or difficult to work with. As the new decade of the 60s dawned, it left behind many of the rules and the established conventions of the 1950s. And, as with the change in style for actresses, there was also a change for actors. Gone were the suave, well-groomed actors of the 40s and 50s, such as George Baker himself. The demand was now for the more controversial, macho, hell-raising actors, such as Oliver Reed, Albert Finney and Peter O'Toole. George Baker said of this time, "We had to look to our laurels, and most of us faded." George continued to be in demand, appearing in various films and in television roles throughout the 60s, including appearances in ITV Play of the Week TV series, Curse of the Fly, and Gideon CID, to name just a few. While George Baker's work life was non-stop, so was his love life. In 1964, he fell in love on set with the actress Sally Home. George said he was living a double life with Sally in London, while his wife Julia was living in the country with their daughters. It was not until 1967 that the whole situation came to a head, when Julia answered the phone at home, announcing to George that Sally was in labour. A fifth daughter was born in the chaos of all this relationship strife. Julia and George eventually divorced. Sally and George married in October 1974 after his divorce from Julia, but George Baker said he carried the guilt of that divorce with him for over 20 years. Although he and Julia always remained friends, and he said that for Sally and himself, getting married was a decision neither of them ever regretted. In the 1970s, George Baker was still pulling in the roles in film and television, including appearances in Z-Cars and the mini-TV series I, Claudius in 1976. During the 1980s, the work continued to flow, and George Baker was working non-stop, with 4 episodes of Doctor Who, 4 episodes of Goodbye Mr. Chips, 3 episodes of A Woman of Substance, and he played Sir Richard of Leeford in the Robin Hood TV series, plus an extensive list of other roles throughout the 1980s. But it was in 1987 that George Baker would step into the role that was to make him a household name, for which he is generally most well known today, and that's the role of Detective Chief Inspector Wexford in the Ruth Rendell Mysteries. The Ruth Rendell Mysteries television series ran from 1987 to 2000. Just as everything had seemingly settled, with the role of Wexford managing to pay off all their debts, life was looking good for George and Sally. But there was tragedy on the horizon. On the 9th of August 1989, George's first wife, Julia, had a fall, which resulted in her death at the age of 63. There were other family bereavements, including the death of George's mother and his 50-year-old brother. Around the same time, George's second wife, Sally Home, had begun to experience severe lower back pain. Initially, her doctors had said that it was nothing to worry about, but soon the pain culminated in Sally being unable to walk properly. A scan revealed she had a tumour pressing on her spine. After a successful operation to remove the tumour, within a year the problems all began again. The tumour had returned, and tragically, on the 3rd of March 1992, Sally died while George was in London working on a script. George had been playing Inspector Wexford for around 5 years, and it was George's on-screen wife Dora, who was played by the actress Louise Ramsey, that supported him through the dark times after Sally's death. It soon became apparent to Louis and George that they were falling in love, and with the blessing of their children, the couple married in All Saints' Church in the village of West Lavington 18 months after Sally's death. In 1999, George faced his own battle with cancer, But fortunately he was able to overcome the illness and make a good recovery. When his role as Detective Inspector Wexford in the Ruth Rendell Mysteries came to an end, George Baker continued to work, and in 2003 he appeared in 6 episodes of Coronation Street. George Baker was very much part of the community where he had initially settled with his second wife Sally, and in 2007 he was awarded an MBE for his charitable work helping to establish a youth club in his home village of West Lavington. George's last television series appearance was as Steve Palmer in an episode of 2007's New Tricks, Ducking and Diving. In addition to performing, George Baker was a gifted radio and television writer and the author of a cookbook. He also adapted episodes of the Ruth Rendell Mysteries, and in 1980 BBC Two aired his prize-winning play The Fatal Spring. Louis and George enjoyed 18 years of marriage together before Louis sadly died in a nursing home in Market Lavington, aged 81, after suffering a series of strokes on the 6th of March 2011. On the 7th of October 2011, just 7 months after his third wife Louis had died, George Baker passed away in the same nursing home. He had suffered a stroke and died of pneumonia at the age of 80. When George Baker was 76, he had been asked what his biggest regret in life was. George replied, "Do you know, I don't have any. It is better to say I did what I could with the cards that I was dealt. There's no point in regretting, or you will keep going backwards and never forwards." So here we are on this blustery autumn day at All Saints Church, West Lavington in Wiltshire. It's a pretty and peaceful walk down to the cemetery. It's lovely. I know that George is buried with his second wife Sally, but I'm not sure where his third wife Louis's final resting place is. So here we are. Their headstone reads, "Sally Home, wife of George Baker and mother to Sarah, September 1930, March 1992. George Baker, actor and writer, April 1931, October 2011. Much loved. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings." When I arrived, it was an absolute rainstorm and I got drenched through. But then the rain abruptly stopped and the sun came out. The previous black skies were now the prettiest blue, all within moments. Nature at its most amazing. Thank you so much for joining me in this step back in time to remember the life of the fabulous George Baker.